Hey guys, welcome back to Past Midnight, where the stories get darker and the air gets heavier. Have you ever noticed that fairy tales are kind of weird? Like, they're supposed to be these sweet little stories that we tell to kids, but if you really think about it, they're kind of unsettling. And they're nothing compared to their original versions, because back then they weren't bedtime stories. They were lessons, warnings, and straight up horror stories. And what got me thinking about this was that I was scrolling through Pandora's website looking at their Disney princess collabs. Super cute, even though they got some of the colorways wrong. And some of the princesses' signature looks were kind of off. But that got me thinking about how far fairy tales have actually come. From their dark, gruesome origins to their sparkly, happily ever afters that we know today. And that's why we're doing this video. So let's talk about the real fairy tales, the ones that weren't so magical. Take Hansel and Gretel, for example. The version that we all know goes a little like this. Two kids get lost in the woods, find a house made of candy, and nearly get eaten by a witch before outsmarting her and escaping. Sounds harmless enough, right? But the real story of Hansel and Gretel is much darker. See, this tale comes from medieval Europe, so we're talking like 1315, 1317, during a time when famine was so bad that parents were actually abandoning their kids because they couldn't afford to feed them. And some people didn't just abandon their kids, they ate them. Cannibalism wasn't just a fairy tale monster, no, it was real life. And in some regions, courts had to explicitly outlaw cannibalism because it was happening too often. I don't know why that was a new law put in place. So that sweet old witch with a candy house, she's a twisted reflection of brutal reality. And in earlier versions, she doesn't just try to eat Hansel. She actually succeeds in eating other children before they finally manage to kill her. Fairy tales didn't just stop at Hansel and Gretel. If you thought that was dark, just wait till you hear the original version of Snow White. Because trust me, Disney left out a lot. Now we all remember their version: jealous queen, poisoned apple, cute dwarfs, true love's kiss. But in the first recorded version by the Brothers Grimm, the queen isn't Snow White's stepmother, she's her real mother. And the jealousy in her ran so deep that she hired a huntsman to go and kill her daughter, Snow White, and bring her liver and lungs back for proof. And she didn't just want them for proof, she wanted to eat them, because she thought that doing so would make her as beautiful as her daughter. But wait, it gets worse. Snow White doesn't just fall for the apple trick. The queen tries to kill her 2 other times. First, by lacing her corset so tight that she almost suffocates. I've done that before, it's not a fun feeling. Not on purpose. And then by stabbing her with a poisoned comb. And the happily ever after ending, not so much, because in the Grimm version, when the queen crashes Snow White's wedding, she's forced to dance over hot coals with iron shoes until she collapses and dies. And the dwarves, they weren't exactly the lovable, hardworking guys that we know today. In some early versions of the tale, they weren't her rescuers, they were her captors. Snow White, young and vulnerable, was essentially their servant, cooking and cleaning for them in return for shelter. And in darker versions, it's implied that she suffered even worse at their hands. Instead of a safe haven, their cottage was more like a prison. The lesson here was perhaps the dangers of vanity and jealousy, or even innocence and purity as virtues. Now, let's move on to one of my favorite, because if you think it's bad, just wait until you hear the real story of Cinderella. In the version that we all know, I mean, what's the worst that happens to the stepsisters? They don't get their man, or they're even embarrassed a little bit. In the original story, things take a much bloodier turn. The stepsisters, desperate to fit into these glass slippers, go to extreme lengths. One slices off her toes. The other, determined to marry the prince, slices off her whole heel. And she thinks she's outsmarted everyone until her plan quickly unravels. As she rides off with the prince thinking that she's gotten away with it, something strange happens. Birds. Yeah, birds swoop down and start shrieking about the blood leaking from her shoe. It's a sign that all is not as it seems, and the prince, hearing the commotion, turns back, and he quickly realizes that this isn't the real Cinderella and goes back for her. And the stepsisters, they get their eyes pecked out as a punishment. And the lesson here is multifaceted, but one common theme is the idea of honesty and humility versus greed and deception. Now let's move on to one that hasn't changed too much from its original version, Little Red Riding Hood. We all know the version where she gets eaten by the wolf. That's scary, but is saved last minute by the huntsman. That version, that's the soft rewrite. In older tellings, there's no huntsman. Red gets eaten, and that's the end of the story. Now here's where it gets creepier, because Red isn't just some innocent little girl wandering the forest. She's actually portrayed as this young girl at the edge of growing up. Some people think the story is trying to warn girls about the dangers of growing up, especially in the context of their sexuality. He represents all these adult dangers lurking in the world. So the wolf, he's not just some creepy animal. He was just waiting for the vulnerable girl who's not paying attention. And in some of the older versions, he actually lures her into his den first. He's not just trying to eat her, he's trying to seduce her too. Red's mother actually sends her straight into danger, kind of unknowingly. So in a way, the whole story feels like a warning, not just about the dangers of the outside world, but also how the people who are supposed to protect you might not always be able to see the full picture for what it is. And that's so sad. Like, why would they even make a fairy tale like that? Parents are supposed to be like gods and goddesses to kids when they're younger. But if you go even further back, in one of the oldest versions, the wolf doesn't just kill the grandmother, he cooks her. And when Red arrives, he convinces her to eat some of these pieces of her grandmother before revealing himself and devouring her too. Some scholars think that this is a warning for some girls about trusting strangers or predatory men. And then there's The Little Mermaid, another one of my favorites.
My Little Mermaid.
And you thought the saddest part of the story was her losing her voice? Hans Christian Andersen's original version was downright brutal. Instead of getting to explore the human world in like a cute montage, she makes a deal where she gets legs, but with a catch. Every step she takes, she feels like she's walking on knives. And the worst part, the prince, he doesn't choose her. He actually goes on to marry someone else. And she's given a choice to kill him in order to survive or die. And because she's in love with him, she sacrifices herself, dissolving into sea foam. The Little Mermaid is all about sacrifice and unrequited love. And Andersen was basically saying that sometimes you can give up everything for someone and they still won't choose you. It's harsh, but it's real. I mean, Ariel literally gives up her home, her family, her voice, and even her physical comfort just to get rejected. And because she's in love with him, chooses to die. It's basically a story about how love isn't always enough. But if you really want to talk about fairy tales that went off the deep end, let's get into Sleeping Beauty. The Disney version is all about a prince waking her up with a true love's kiss, but that was far from the original story. In the 17th century version, The Sun, Moon, and Talia, Sleeping Beauty doesn't wake up from a kiss. She doesn't wake up at all. A king actually finds her unconscious body and he assaults her while she's in a death-like sleep and then leaves. completely unaware of what he's just done. 9 months later, she gives birth to twins in a coma-like state. And because these fairy tales were all about dark irony, one of her newborns, searching for milk, actually sucks on her finger and pulls out the enchanted splinter that was keeping her asleep. That's what finally wakes her. Not love, not a prince, but childbirth and pain. That's not where the story ends, because the king, yeah, he was married, and when his wife finds out about Talia and the twins, she goes full villain mode. She orders the babies to be captured and cooked in order to be fed to the king, because apparently these stories had some kind of weird obsession with cannibalism. Luckily, the cook hides the babies and tricks the queen, serving her a different meal instead. The queen, she doesn't stop there. She tries to burn Talia alive. The king arrives just in time to save Talia and has his wife executed instead. And because fairy tales love a messed up ending, Talia, the woman who was literally violated by the king, ends up marrying the king who did it. Yeah, not sure what the lesson there was. So if you ever thought that Disney's version needed a little more realism, trust me, you don't want it. Now, over time, these stories got cleaned up and turned into Disney movies, bedtime stories, and happily ever afters. But at their core, they're dark. They came from a world where life was brutal, death was common, and fairy tales weren't just stories, they were warnings. So the next time you hear one of the classics, just remember that once upon a time, they were more terrifying than any horror movie. And that's it. If you guys are getting one of the Pandora rings, let me know which one. I definitely wanted the Jasmine one, but seeing that it's silver instead of gold, which is weird, I don't know if I'll be getting it. I hope they redo some of them. As always, thanks for hanging out with me. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. And remember, if a wolf invites you for a walk in the woods, yeah, maybe sit that one out. Until next time, bye guys.